If it's Tuesday, a 4th of July parade becomes the site of the country's latest mass shooting. What we're learning about the victims, the investigation, and the weapon that killed 7 people and wounded dozens more, just days after President Biden signed the first major gun legislation, gun safety law, in decades. We're expecting to hear from officials there in Illinois at any moment. Plus, the suburban swing vote, how the nationwide fights on abortion rights and gun control are reshaping the midterm elections. What it means for both parties that these contentious cultural issues will likely keep heating up throughout this summer. And later, as Russia intensifies its attacks in Ukraine, an American basketball star jailed in Moscow, sending a personal plea for help to President Biden to intervene in her case. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Peter Alexander in Today for Chuck, and we expect another update from authorities in Illinois at any moment on the deadly mass shooting at a 4th of July parade in suburban Chicago. We're going to bring that to you just as soon as it begins. In the last hour, sadly, we learned that a 7th victim has died. At least 30 other people were injured. And earlier today, police revealed new information about the person of interest, now in custody, 21-year-old Robert Crimo III. And they said that he had planned the shooting for weeks.
He brought a high-powered rifle to this parade. He accessed the roof of a business via a fire escape ladder and began opening fire on the innocent Independence Day celebration goers. During the attack, Crimo was dressed in women's clothing, and investigators do believe he did this to conceal his facial tattoos and his identity and help him during the escape with the other people who were fleeing the chaos. Following the attack, Crimo exited the roof. He dropped his rifle and he blended in with the crowd and he escaped. He walked to his mother's home, who lived in the area, and he blended right in with everybody else as they were running around, almost as he was an innocent spectator as well.
Police say that the gun used in the attack was purchased legally. The gunman fired more than 70 rounds from a high-powered rifle while hiding out on the roof of a nearby business, as you heard the sheriff's deputy there say. Officers arrested Crimo after he was spotted in his mother's car hours after the attack. They say they found another weapon in that car, also purchased legally, as well as others at his home. He has not been charged with any crime yet, and federal authorities say they do not plan on filing any charges against him at this point. Meanwhile, the president's orders, flags outside the White House and at all federal buildings are now flying at half staff in memory of the 7 innocent lives lost yesterday. I'm joined now by NBC News correspondent Dasha Burns. She is in Highland Park. Also with me is Pete Williams. Of course, he covers the Justice Department for NBC News. And Dasha, to you, we're learning a lot more about this shooter. In the last news conference, we got a lot of details. We're going to hear from these authorities now, we think, within the next 20 to 30 minutes or so. What particular questions are we still waiting for some answers to?
Hey, Peter, good to be with you. We are still waiting on a lot of answers, frankly. We got a lot of information in the last press briefing, but there is still more to learn. We're waiting to find out when charges are coming, what those charges are going to be. We also still don't have names released from the coroner's office yet of those now 7 victims. And, Peter, as I've been speaking to community members here, it's interesting because while there has been a lot of shock, there hasn't been as much surprise as you might expect. There hasn't been this attitude from the people, at least that I've spoken with, of it couldn't happen here. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, there was a March for Our Lives on the very same street as this parade. People have seen these shootings in other communities on the news. So they weren't surprised that it happened here, but that did not soften the blow to actually have this experience, have their families, have their children have to go through this. I spoke to a woman named Emily. She's a mother of 2. She's a pediatrician. She's a lifelong resident of Highland Park. She says she's been to this parade every single year since she was a baby. And this time, instead of celebration, she was running for her life with her 5-year-old daughter, separated from her husband and her 9-year-old daughter. They ended up finding safety in a store, in a bathroom, a single occupancy bathroom bathroom where they hid for 2 hours, Peter, with 16 other people. Imagine you and your 5-year-old in silence for 2 hours in a bathroom. I want you to hear just a little bit of what she told me. You were supposed to watch the fireworks with your kids. What is 4th of July for you going forward?
Terror. It is absolute terror. People were blowing off fireworks from their homes last night while we shivered in our beds because it sounded like the sounds of the AR that we heard, and that continues to echo through my head for 24 hours. So I will no longer think of this as a day of freedom, but as a day that we have become almost enslaved to guns.
You know, Peter, as the hours pass here, the devastation starts to turn to anger and to frustration. And I think what people are looking for from law enforcement at the local level, from leaders at the state and at the federal level is what's next? What can we do here? How do we prevent this from happening? We saw that digital trail that he left of disturbing videos. People want answers on why this happened.
Dasha Burns in Highland Park for us. Dasha, thank you. Pete, I want to bring you into this conversation. Obviously, the law enforcement officials there deserve a lot of credit for their quick reaction time after their ability to find this shooter before he might get away or do anything else. But there are real questions about what could have been done preemptively. And I want to ask you about this idea behind red flag laws. How would law enforcement become aware of the kinds of video that we now know that this shooter, this alleged shooter, had online?
Yeah, I don't know of any way that local police would know about disturbing videos that somebody posted unless someone raised a hand. And, you know, the Secret Service has done an annual survey about mass shootings, and they all seem to have the same numbing quality to them. The person very seldom just snaps. They usually give off some sort of warning signs. And here you have warning signs going back many weeks, many months, possibly years, and yet even though hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people, saw his disturbing videos that he posted on YouTube, some of which he did as a rapper, calling himself Awake the Rapper, nobody ever raised a hand about it, at least as far as we know. Now, the police have said they had some interaction with him, but as far as we know, the only criminal record he has is some very minor things like underage possession of tobacco and maybe some traffic incidents. The police say otherwise, that he was unknown to them. So, you know, I just don't know if it's not people directly connected to him, his friends, his relatives, somebody who saw this disturbing behavior. If they didn't raise a hand, I don't know who would. But you talked about how quickly the law enforcement got onto him. Just to add a couple of other details there, the police say that as he left, he dropped the weapon. Maybe he didn't want to be seen with it, whatever, but that was a key thing because they could initially look at the serial number and immediately do a trace, and they say he himself bought the weapon legally just recently. He's 21 years old. He turns 22 in August, so he could have bought a rifle when he was 18. He was certainly old enough to buy a rifle, and he bought it legally, and that's one of the ways that they were able to trace it to him. And then just filling in a few other details, his cell phone showed up last night in Madison, Wisconsin, and police now say that after leaving the scene, he actually drove to Madison and then came back to Chicago. Why he went to Madison isn't clear to us. And the other thing I would add, Peter, is just so far there's been no indication of a motive here, that he was trying to target people because of their race or religion or something else. So it's not classified as a hate crime. I suspect we're just going to see, right for now anyway, fairly conventional murder charges.
Pete, this conversation brings up a question I hadn't been thinking about until I heard you here, which is in this new law that was just passed, the gun safety law passed by Congress, signed by the president within the last 2 weeks or so. It says that those youngest gun buyers between the ages of 18 and 21 will now face an enhanced background check. Were that law in effect, were someone between 18 and 21 to go through that enhanced background check, would that allow them to sort of inspect his social media record?
I don't know, because, you know, what that enhanced background check is, the federal regulations to carry out that statute haven't been written yet. But, you know, I've had this question a couple of times from people saying, you know, doesn't anybody look at these people's social media when they go to get a gun? And the answer is no. I mean, the disqualifying factors are what the FBI looks at: felony conviction, domestic violence conviction, drug use, a judged mentally defective. But can you imagine the difficulty that would be involved in trying to look at someone's social media videos? Whose responsibility would that be? I mean, it seems like a good idea in the abstract, but how would you carry it out?
Pete Williams, we appreciate your expertise in joining us with some new information as we speak to you this hour. We want to bring in the mayor of Highland Park, Illinois, Mayor Nancy Rotering, as we wait for that news conference from officials any minute. And first, Madam Mayor, I want to send my condolences to you. My mom grew up in the neighboring community. I spent a ton of time in Highland Park when I was at Northwestern University. I have so many friends there, some of whom were among those who were affected by this. So our thoughts are certainly with you. I want to pick up on this conversation that I was having with Pete right now. And I guess at the end of the day, who is it that's responsible for raising the red flag in a situation like this when they see troubling behavior like they did for this suspect?
Who's responsible? We all are. Friends are, family members are. But at the end of the day, let's talk about the fact that in other nations around this world, there are people who post crazy videos, who have anger issues, who are mentally ill, and they aren't going out and committing mass carnage because they don't have access to weapons of war. So to me, it's a multi-pronged issue.
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the day, we need to talk about why we as a nation, who theoretically were celebrating freedom yesterday, are, as Emily said, now enslaved to guns. This is an absolute tragedy that came into our town.
Madam Mayor, we're going to hear from some other officials, yourself included, I suspect, in the next 30 minutes or so at a news conference. If you can give us a sense of what we should anticipate. Have charges now been prepared, or are we expected to learn that those have been filed?
I don't believe we are to that point. My understanding is there's an effort to get those achieved by this evening. If not, obviously, we have until tomorrow by law, and then that will be taken care of. But the team that has been here, ATF, the FBI, the Illinois State Police, and police from municipalities all across the region have just done an unbelievably admirable job, and we're so appreciative to their hard work.
So walk us through, for those that won't be able to join, what should we expect to hear in this news conference? What are some of the new details that you've learned since we last heard from you?
I believe that there is a plan to release the names of the deceased. And I don't know that there's going to be much more beyond that. The opportunity for us to come together as a community, will be announcing more information regarding vigils. At this point, we are still just recovering from this fresh grief, this profound sadness. Yesterday, I think most people were just in shock and disbelief. Today, it has really set in, the pain that these families are going through, the pain that our entire community is feeling.
And if I can ask you about, we just learned within the last hour or so that a seventh individual had died as a result of their wounds there. Any more details about that person? Was it an adult or a child, or anything more you can share about that awful loss?
Until the coroner makes her announcement, it's not my position to say so. But suffice it to say that my husband was right there where it happened, and several of the witnesses recounted that based on the injuries that they saw, it would have been virtually impossible for people to recover. It was just pure devastation. People need to recognize these guns are absolutely meant to destroy human life. And again, I question national leadership's decision to allow these to continue to be in the United States.
So what do you say to those lawmakers? They just got as much done as seemingly they could get done with bipartisan support as it relates to gun safety laws. A lot of Democrats in particular say it wasn't far enough. Some Republicans say they went too far. What is your message to those where there's sort of this stasis, this inability to move beyond that?
The absolute heartbreak in terms of the stories that I've heard coming out of yesterday's event should be enough to motivate these people to do the right thing. So too should have the stories coming out of Uvalde. So too should have the stories coming out of Buffalo. I could list all those cities. I've heard from several of those mayors. We are at our wits' end. There is a handbook that is sent to mayors for them to know what to do after a mass shooting. It's 198 pages long, and I got calls from several mayors yesterday who said, we understand what you're going through. Here's the book on now what to do next. That's unbelievable. We are the United States of America, and we have a handbook on what to do following a mass shooting in your community.
Is the reason that Democrats in that state, obviously you have a Democratic governor, is there any new push, or would you be behind it for an assault weapons ban across the state of Illinois if it's not something that can be accomplished nationally?
So we banned assault weapons in 2013, and we managed to survive a litigation from the NRA all the way to the United States Supreme Court. When the governor was here yesterday, I shared with him proposed legislation that we've been trying to get passed since 2018 to remove state preemption in Illinois. And that's a great first step. I would love to see a statewide ban, but let's be honest. Indiana, Missouri, Wisconsin are all very close by.
Yeah.
People travel interstate all the time. It needs to be a national effort. There needs to be a desire on the part of our leadership to stop the carnage.
Highland Park Mayor Nancy Rotering will be watching your news conference a short time from now. We appreciate your making time for us today. Again, our thoughts with you and sending a lot of strength to the people of your community. Thank you.
Thank you.
As we have said, we are awaiting that news conference in Highland Park. We're going to bring it to you live just as soon as it happens. But up next, the gun in the Highland Park attack. It was obtained legally. So what can and cannot stricter gun laws do when it comes to preventing mass shootings? We're going to speak to an expert. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. We're still awaiting the start of that news conference from Highland Park, Illinois. We're going to take you there live just as soon as the briefing begins. But joining me now is Adam Skaggs, the Chief Counsel and Policy Director at the Giffords Law Center. Adam, thanks for being here. The president, as you know, signed new gun legislation just 10 days ago. So based on what we know right now, would yesterday's shooting in Highland Park have been prevented under this new law? Is there any indication of that?
I don't think there is. Obviously, we're still learning a great deal about yesterday's horrific shooting, and details are not totally known. But, as I understand it, the shooter was 21 years old when he purchased the rifle that he used in the shooting. While the bill does include important heightened standards for background checks for people buying a rifle of that sort between the ages of 18 and 21. It's my understanding the shooter was already over the age of 21, so those would not have applied to that transaction.
So if he was 21, as we're now learning, when he would have purchased these weapons, turns 22 soon, would these sort of enhanced background checks, would they force law enforcement or sellers to take a better look at someone's social media content, their imprints, like this guy who had all sorts of vicious and violent messaging online?
Well, I don't think that a firearms dealer who's going to run the background check the way it's required under federal law is going to realistically have the bandwidth to do an inquiry on his or her own into things like social media. And frankly, I don't think the federal government has the resources to search through YouTube and social media platforms for every single American who's buying firearms. That's just not practical as a matter of resources. But I do think, friends, neighbors, you've heard from prior guests, all of us have a responsibility. And anybody who becomes aware of somebody posting threats online, somebody engaging in, hateful speech and threatening to commit horrific acts like this, we all have a duty to report that. And unfortunately, now some of the social media platforms, their best interest when they receive complaints about threats or other offensive material is just to take those posts down. And all too often, they don't then go to law enforcement and share those reports and those threats because the social media companies are incentivized to kind of protect themselves.
Yeah.
And that's by taking these down.
Adam, I want to break down more of this beyond the social media footprint, but it does seem like it's such a red flag here. So where do we broadly draw that line? There's tons of young people in this country and others who have surely seen threatening or disturbing content online. How do you teach people what to flag and what not to flag? What conversation should we be having with our teenage and older kids on this topic tonight?
Well, look, I think you hear all too often when we see tragedies like this that there were warning signs, that there, whether it's social media or otherwise, that these, shooters ended up prior to the incident, threatening others, bullying classmates and that sort of thing. And I think we need to all educate ourselves better about how to distinguish, idle comments from actual threats, how to detect dangerous behavior. And we need to make sure we have the tools to report that to law enforcement so they can do something about it. The legislation that just passed does have support for the states to implement so-called extreme risk laws. Those are laws that allow you to report when somebody's making these kinds of threats and they pose a danger to themselves or others. And in the states where we've seen those laws enacted, we've seen both that they have been helpful in preventing gun suicide and also that they've prevented mass shootings like the sort that unfortunately are happening all too often.
So in the wake of this new gun safety law, what does it tell you that we are not seeing that same urgency for renewed gun legislation after this new shooting?
Well, look, I think Americans have had enough. They're sick and tired of this unrelenting drumbeat of gun violence. Don't forget, it's not just horrific mass shootings like we saw in Highland Park, in Uvalde, in Buffalo. Every day, 100 Americans are killed with guns in this country. And if our elected officials don't wake up and respond to that loud and clear demand for them to take action, Americans are going to find different leaders. I'm encouraged that the Senate was able to get almost 2/3 of the senators to vote for, an incremental step forward. It may have been a modest step forward, but it was a step forward. And it needs to just be the beginning. It can't be the end, because if that's the last thing that our leaders do at the national level, we're just going to see this violence continuing unrelenting.
I want to ask you about the former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. Of course, she's going to be at the White House later this week to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. If you can, just tell us what that says about her efforts on behalf of this issue and what sort of new plans there are for her to talk about gun reform with the president during any upcoming visit.
Well, look, the only thing I can say about the former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords is she's an inspiration. It's absolutely inspiring to see her leading the efforts of our organization, leading Americans as they call for the change that we're talking about. She is just an inspiration. She's tireless. She's dedicated. She works harder than anybody I know. And she, of course, still suffers from the injuries she sustained when one of her constituents attempted to assassinate her. But she fights every single day. And it's an inspiration to us, all of us, fighting for stronger gun safety laws, fighting to save lives from gun violence.
Yeah, we look forward to seeing her here in Washington at the White House on Thursday. Adam Skaggs, we appreciate your time and perspective. Thank you so much. We are awaiting that news conference from officials in Highland Park. You can see the microphones are there as well. We'll bring you it live just as soon as it happens. You're watching Meet the Press Now.
I think yesterday's shooting is another example of what the problem is. The problem is mental health, and these young men who seem to be inspired to commit these atrocities. So I think the bill that we passed targeted the problem.
Welcome back. That was Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell today responding to a question on whether more action should be taken on gun control in the wake of the shooting in Highland Park this week. McConnell voted for the bipartisan gun bill that was just signed into law by President Biden. My NBC colleagues report that as voters voice their anger with lawmakers over hot-button cultural issues like guns and abortion, McConnell is urging Republicans to downplay them as a way to help his party win back the suburbs. I'm joined now by our distinguished panel, political reporter and MSNBC contributor Betsy Woodruff Swan, Republican strategist and MSNBC political analyst Rick Tyler, and Democratic strategist Xochitl Hinojosa. Nice to see all of you. Rick, let's start with you if we can. We just heard from Mitch McConnell there. The desire with the bipartisan efforts on guns was to sort of win back those suburbs, in particular the women who moved away from Donald Trump. Then the abortion issue blows up in front of them as well. Are these sort of divisions in the Republican Party broadly going to have an impact on that effort?
Look, I think when you're running an election, you go with what you think is your strongest case to make, and I think the strongest case to make for most people is the price of groceries and the price of gas. Will guns be an issue and abortion be an issue? Yes. On abortion, I don't think it'll be that much of an issue because I think people made up their minds a long time ago. On guns, if you look at it, 7.5 million more people have bought guns in the last 2 years. They do that. Guns aren't the source of violence. This is a reaction to violence. So people are buying guns to protect themselves, record numbers of guns. And a lot of those guns are ending up in suburbs also. And those people who are buying guns are using them to protect themselves and their family, and they're not thinking of themselves as they're part of the problem.
Xochitl, what do Democrats say to those who are saying, hey, you guys control the White House and both chambers of Congress right now. Why not? Why haven't you done more on this issue?
Well, absolutely. And President Biden said that we have to do more on this issue, that this was just a start. What you heard from Mitch McConnell is that he's talking a lot about mental health, which a lot of the Republican Party tends to lean in on mental health when they're talking about the gun issue. The reality is, though, is that Republicans refuse to vote for more funds towards mental health, expanding the ACA, other things like that.
So I dare interrupt you only because the officials are walking in the microphone now. I want you guys to stay with us. Let's hear whatever news they have to report right now. Here they are in Highland Park, Illinois.
Good afternoon. On July 4th, 2022, at approximately 10:15 a.m., Highland Park police were on the scene of an active shooter in the area Central Avenue and 2nd Street, Highland Park, while an Independence Day parade was in progress. The Lake County Coroner's Office was notified and responded to the scene. It is with a heavy heart that I bring to you the names of the victims of that tragedy. 64-year-old Catherine Goldstein of Highland Park, 35-year-old Irina McCarthy of Highland Park, 37-year-old Kevin McCarthy of Highland Park, 63-year-old Jacqueline Sundheim of Highland Park, 88-year-old Stephen Strauss of Highland Park, 78-year-old Nicholas Toledo Zaragoza of Morelos, Mexico. We have also been notified that there is a 7th victim that died at a hospital located outside of Lake County. I will now give the microphone to the Mayor of Highland Park, Mayor Nancy Rotering.
The Highland Park community, like so many before us, is devastated. It is impossible to imagine the pain of this kind of tragedy until it happens in your backyard. Our focus the last 36 hours has been on the perpetrator of this heinous crime. As we now put the names and faces of those lost yesterday, family, friends, guests, longtime residents of the Highland Park community, our focus shifts to the victims and those left behind. This crisis has devastated entire families and our community in a single moment, and we know it will take time to heal. On behalf of the community and the world that mourns alongside us, I offer loved ones of those who passed our condolences. I thank those who have organized prayer vigils to help support the weight of our shared sorrow. We've listed those on our website, and while we're hurting, we know that we will continue to come together and support each other as we always do in difficult times. We are Highland Park strong.
Thank you, Mayor. There were some questions at our last press briefing about prior contacts that law enforcement may have had with Crimo III. We've done some research, gathered some reports, and I'm going to relay some information from 2 prior instances that occurred here in Highland Park. The first was in April of 2019. An individual contacted Highland Park Police Department a week after learning of Mr. Crimo attempting suicide. This was a delayed report, so Highland Park still responded to the residents a week later, spoke with Crimo, spoke with Crimo's parents, and the matter was being handled by mental health professionals at that time. There was no law enforcement action to be taken. It was a mental health issue handled by those professionals. The second occurred in September of 2019. A family member reported that Crimo said he was going to kill everyone, and Crimo had a collection of knives. The police responded to his residence. The police removed 16 knives, a dagger, and a sword from Crimo's home. At that time, there was no probable cause to arrest. There were no complaints that were signed by any of the victims. The Highland Park Police Department, however, did immediately notify the Illinois State Police of the incident. Shifting gears a little bit, talking about the investigation itself. The community has been absolutely terrific with providing information to law enforcement investigators throughout this. But we're asking the community to, if they're able to dig a little deeper and recall some specific instances from the event based on video surveillance recovered by our investigators. We're very certain that there was a female witness who saw Cremo drop an object inside of a red blanket behind Ross's at 625 Central Avenue immediately following the shooting. We've not been able to identify this witness yet, but we're asking, if you are the witness and you are hearing this, please call 800, call FBI. Investigators really would like to speak to you about this. We're also asking that anyone with any firsthand information about Cremo relevant to this investigation also call 800, call FBI. Please keep in mind, though, we're asking for firsthand information that could be relevant, that could help investigators. We're not asking for third-party information or information heard through the grapevine, only if it's firsthand knowledge that you have. To update the victim count, including those that have perished, there are approximately 45 injured or deceased from this incident. At about 5:30 this evening, the state's attorney's office will be holding a press conference, and we anticipate an announcement of charges at that time. With that, we'll take some questions.
So going to this September incident, obviously people are going to look at this and say, well, this could have been an opportunity to stop what we saw here. Your view on that, and how are these things supposed to be handled? How do you stop a shooter if someone's calling police saying, hey, we have a problem?
So the question is the response to the September incident. The police responded there. Police can't make an arrest unless there is probable cause to make an arrest or somebody is willing to sign complaints regarding the arrest. Absent of those things, the police don't have power to detain somebody. Now, if there is an issue where there is the necessity to involuntarily commit somebody to the hospital, that's an option, but that wasn't an option at that time. That it didn't fall in that category. But nonetheless, Highland Park Police did notify the Illinois State Police of that.
But as a law enforcement professional, you see someone that when I kill someone, then you can purchase several guns, like you said, legally. How do you view that?
The threat was directed at family inside of the home.
Yeah, but you could even buy guns when it makes a clear threat that it's coming.
So in order to purchase a gun legally in Illinois, one has to possess a FOID card. That's a process that is solely managed for the state police, and I'm not able to speak to that process.
Chris, you mentioned how much the community has been helpful in this case with videos, with sending information to you guys. So many people I've been talking to are asking, how can this be prevented in the future? Given the amount of social media posts, the sort of disturbing content that he had posted, would you recommend that community members in this community or others flag police to that kind of information? You said you weren't aware of it beforehand. Were you, if you were aware of it, could this have prevented something like this, considering the red flag laws and other laws here in the state?
So the question is essentially social media. If we had known about some of the posts, would we have investigated? Do we encourage the community to report those? And the answer is absolutely. If the public sees something that is concerning online with anybody, they should notify the social media network it's posted on. They should notify local law enforcement. And that's when we get involved and we conduct an investigation. Law enforcement's going to do everything they possibly can to ensure the community is kept safe. But if we don't know about it, it's hard for us to investigate.
Under the red flag laws in the state, though, would this potentially have been enough for you to confiscate weapons or take some sort of action?
So in the case of September, the knives that Cremo possessed, they were confiscated and they were secured for safekeeping.
It's rifles, and considering the social media posts and the videos that we have now seen.
So at that time, there was no information that he possessed any firearms, any rifles. Would that be enough if he's making threats? It's a case-by-case basis. I don't want to speak broadly to the issue. It depends on the circumstances. There are circumstances where law enforcement does have that authority to obtain a seizure order, but it is situational dependent every single time.
There's a report that Cremo visited a synagogue here in town during Passover. Do you know anything about that? Can you speak to me?
That's nothing I know about at this time.
You mentioned that the weapons, the rifles, were legally purchased in this general Chicago area, but can you specifically say when they were purchased?
They were purchased After that September incident. I don't have the exact dates. I believe it was in 2020 and 2021.
This morning we were discussing whether we had any additional information on motivation. You said not yet. Is there any new information in that regard?
Investigators have been really tirelessly working since Crimo was taken into custody, trying to determine motive. At this point, there is no definitive motive that he had.
Is he talking?
He has been talking to investigators.
Chris, when was the handgun part of thing? When was this with him?
I don't have that information.
The object that you said was dropped behind Ross, do you know what that was?
It was the rifle, and it was in a red blanket.
Chris, do you have any information that he may have tried to, after the shooting, tried to check himself into a hospital, Lutheran General Hospital, as you referred in your reports?
No, we do not have that information.
So just to follow up on the last September incident, you said that involuntarily committing him was not an option. Can you explain that? What are the options for officers?
Based on that time, based on those circumstances, that was not an option. It did not fall in that category.
What would it require?
Again, it's case by case specific.
Were Irina and Kevin McCarthy husband and wife, brother and sister? What's their relationship?
I'd have to get back to you on that. I don't know.
Chris, do you have any information
on the handguns that you talked earlier about? How many were there? Were they legally purchased? Anything on that? The count, the sheer number?
So he had purchased five firearms. 5 firearms, and that includes rifles and handguns as well.
So the other 3 legally purchased, and they were handguns?
There were a combination of which, I don't have the exact count, at least 2 rifles, some pistols, and possibly a shotgun. Those were seized at his father's home pursuant to a search warrant yesterday.
What was the size of the knife collection, and did he ever get it back after the incident?
I would have to do a little research on that.
What time period were those 5 weapons purchased?
Approximately a year.
Is there any information about that 7th victim who passed away in age, perhaps?
Not yet, but we are working on obtaining some information.
What county is that victim in?
Cook.
If the charges are being filed, as you said, probably around 5 o'clock, does that mean there will be an arraignment likely tomorrow morning, or?
That would be my yes.
You don't know
if charges are filed today, it's very likely he'll appear in bond court tomorrow morning.
Do we know do you have more evidence about, or more explanation of what you found in the car? You said the rifle was found in the blanket, and what you found on the roof. To get some more specifics on that.
Evidence technicians are collecting a lot of shell casings, but as far as anything of evidentiary value, that's the extent.
In the car, you said there was rifles?
In the car, there was a rifle.
Anything else?
Was it loaded?
I would have to check and get back to you.
Do you know where he was heading in that car with that second rifle?
He drove around to a number of places. He drove into Wisconsin, then he came back into Illinois. That's when the alert person who recognized the vehicle description from the press briefing called 911, and he was stopped.
Chris, are you able to speak to any federal investigation, any possible federal indictments where he would be brought into the federal system?
So the FBI, the ATF, our federal partners, the Department of Justice are very involved in this case. I can't speak for them. All I can say is they are on the ground here working with us in lockstep. And I could take 2 more.
You know, where in Wisconsin? Back to the September incident, some police notified state police. What was the follow-up from state police at that point? And was there any monitoring given what had happened of his social media accounts then? And should there have been if not?
Do you want to speak to that?
My name is Master Sergeant Delilah Garcia. I'm Public Information Officer, Deputy Chief. So basically in September of 2019, ISP did receive information from Highland Park Police Department, and at that time, the individual named in the report did not have a FOID card or anything to revoke or to review. So at that point, that FOID part of it was our stance on that.
And there was nothing done to say this person shouldn't be able to get. Is there any mechanism to say this person shouldn't be able to get a FOID card in the future? Is any action like that taken?
Well, at that time, basically, so he didn't have a pending application, so there was nothing to review at that time when we got that notification. We didn't know, and a few months later, something else would happen.
What would state police have to have done or have to have seen in order to try to involuntarily commit someone based on those facts and those circumstances?
Involuntary commit someone?
Right. So the lead thing to you to follow up on, after looking at the facts from that, was that an option that you considered? Well, this person might need to be involuntarily committed?
Well, there was no FOID application at the time.
Correct, but the lead came to you, right? This person had knives, obviously the threat that was posed. So your role was only whether he had a firearm or not?
Right.
And the state law, does it allow you to flag someone and say, hey, we're flagging this person, they should be... Are you allowed to say this person can't get a FOID card in the future?
More questions regarding that procedure from the state police will be forthcoming. So we know there's going to be some questions directed to the state police on procedure, how FOID card applications work, when a notification comes in from local law enforcement. That is much better answered by the state police. It's very hard to speak to their policies and procedures. One more.
Where in Wisconsin he traveled to, and how did you track him? Was it iPass?
I don't want to get into how we know he was in Wisconsin, but we know he traveled to the Madison area before turning around and coming back to Illinois.
Did his parents,
Last question.
Did his parents ask, was his parents involved when the knives were taken from him? Did they report that he was threatening, and that's the reason why they came to the house to get the knives?
A family member reported that he was being threatening.
So in other words, the family member reports the knives being there, but then he's buying guns, and nobody said nothing.
I'm not quite following your question. The police responded. The police responded in September, okay, to this call. They responded. They took the knives out of the home. They filed the paperwork with the Illinois State Police. At that time, there was no function to make an arrest.
But
there was
the
no.
parents are there watching him buy 5 and 6 and 7 guns.
I don't know if the parents were there. I can't speak to that. All right. Thank you. We'll be back at 5:30.
All right, guys. Just as a reminder, we're going to the west side of the scene at this point.
We've been listening to the Lake
Green Bay.
County
So that'll be
Deputy Chief detailing, Deputy Sheriff detailing some new information as it relates to the investigation into the awful tragedy that took place in Highland Park, Illinois, beginning by identifying 6 of the 7 victims, those who were killed, ranging in age from 35 to 88. We learned within the last hour that a 7th individual was killed. Still no detail on the age or identity of that individual. But then beyond that, we learned some new details about the prior contacts with this alleged shooter, that there had been at least 2 contacts with him in the past, both in the year 2019, first in April, where it was reported to authorities that he had attempted suicide. And then a few months later, that was in April, and in September, members of the suspect's family contacted authorities and said that he had been threatening, quote, to kill everyone. And when they came to his home at that time, they found 16 knives, daggers, and some other weapons, not guns, that they removed from him. Nonetheless, after that point, he was able to buy at least 5 weapons, including one that authorities say was used in this awful mass shooting. I want to get to Pete Williams, who covers the Justice Department for us here at NBC. And Pete, I think the big takeaway for a lot of folks is going to be the red flags were waved. They brought the authorities in and said this guy threatened to kill everyone, in the words of that official, and yet nothing stopped him from purchasing those weapons whatever period of time later. Was this just simply a failure in the system?
Well, I don't know the particulars of Illinois. You heard the police spokesman talking about a FOID card, F-O-I-D. That's Firearm Owner's Identification Card. That's the prerequisite that you have to get in order to buy a firearm in Illinois. So he got one of those. So there would be a check at that time and then another background check when he bought the gun. But of course, the background check when he bought the gun, in the federal system, this would never have shown up in the FBI's National InstaCheck background system. Because in order to be disqualified to buy a gun in the federal system, felony conviction, misdemeanor domestic violence, drug abuse, or adjudged mentally defective or hospitalized for mental health reasons. So it wouldn't have met any of the federal standards. The question is, would it have met the standards under Illinois state law? And I think that's something we're going to have to look at, Peter. I would be somewhat surprised if it did, but that's just the way that state legislatures and Congress has set up the background check system. Just the fact that somebody had threatened suicide at some point, at least in the federal system, wouldn't, or even threatened to kill people and made statements like that, would not, this is going to be, hard for many people to believe, but that's what the law is. Those facts alone would not disqualify someone from buying a gun. That's the way the law is.
Yeah, no doubt. That may be the way the law is, but I think you're exactly right. That's what's going to frustrate a lot of people, right? Because the system would have appeared to have worked and that the authorities were flagged about this, but without a formal complaint and without some further pursuit of this, he is effectively has a clean slate when he tries to pursue the purchase of any weapons going forward.
More than a formal complaint, there would have to have been charges filed. I'm not sure what the felony would be for threatening to kill everyone. That's such a generalized statement. If the family didn't make a complaint, if no charges were filed, if he was never convicted of a felony, that wouldn't have been disqualified.
But even some mental health related, is there any vehicle as a mental health issue unless he's he's sort of directed to some facility to look after his well-being?
Well, no. I mean, that's what the law. We have had this conversation before many times in the past when people who have troubling aspects in their personalities, nonetheless, or their histories, were nonetheless able to buy a gun. And what the federal law says is that you can only be disqualified from buying a gun if you are adjudicated, I think is the word, adjudicated mentally defective, or there's a history that you were referred to a hospital or some kind of facility for mental health treatment. Failing that, there's no disqualification.
Pete Williams, we appreciate you helping break that down for us. I want to get to Dasha Burns, our correspondent who's in Highland Park right now. And Dasha, you really have to sort of separate these two issues. One is the investigation. The separate is the awful loss of so many lives and the families still suffering, still mourning as they come to terms with this tragedy. We just learned about 6 individuals. You've been speaking to folks there. We now learned a 7th lost their life as a result of this awful tragedy. What do we know about these individuals and about the survivors?
Well, I'll tell you, Peter, as we were standing there crowded around the law enforcement officials, when they said that number, 45 people injured or deceased, there was an audible gasp, audible devastation among everyone standing there hearing that number, 45 individuals. And when the coroner read through that list, I'll just read their names. Catherine Goldstein, 88 years old. Irina McCarthy, 35 years old. Kevin McCarthy, 37 years old. Jacqueline Sondheim, 63 years old. Stephen Strauss, 88 years old. Nicholas Toledo, 78 years old. Folks in their 30s, folks in their 70s, folks in their 80s. And as I've been speaking to people here today, Peter, the devastation is turning to frustration, as I said, and it's turning to the question of why did this happen? Why was this not prevented? When we're seeing these reports, we're seeing these disturbing videos that were posted online. Clearly, there was a digital trail that this individual left behind. And I asked law enforcement officials today, they talked about how the help of the community really is one of the reasons that they were able to apprehend the alleged gunman here, them sending videos and flagging information. I asked, should the community be flagging these kinds of videos, people that are seeing folks posting on social media, things that are disturbing, things that are threatening? And they said absolutely. They did not know about these videos, though there were those previous incidents that you discussed with Pete there. They weren't aware of the videos that he posted online, though thousands of people obviously viewed them. Now, the more complicated question is, if they were aware, what would that mean now? And that's where the answer got a little bit more murky with red flag laws in this state. At what point can police intervene? Can they confiscate firearms? That is a case-by-case basis, and they couldn't quite answer, what that would have looked like in this case if they were, in fact, aware of the disturbing videos that we now have seen, Peter.
Dasha Burns, keep up the good work there in Highland Park. You're right. It was stunning to hear that 45 individuals had been hit by bullets there, 7 of them now losing their lives as so many others try to recover and try to survive from their injuries. Thank you so much. Let's get to our panel that's joining us here at the table. Betsy, I want to ask you, I think we talked to Pete, and I think all of us are sort of shaking our heads with this sort of level of frustration that even though it seems like the flags were waved, that there's nothing that the system, at least as it exists right now, as detailed by that conversation, can do to stop someone like this from being able to access firearms, weapons to kill.
Right, and there also clearly seemed to be a disconnect between local law enforcement and state police, who almost ping-ponged back and forth during that press conference. It felt a little bit like a hot potato of who should have been responsible for keeping this young man who was obviously troubled, who obviously presented a danger to the people around him, from being able to purchase and then subsequently use a weapon. And that's one of the challenges in any conversation about laws that are designed to promote gun safety, is that these laws are only as good as the way they're enforced. They only work to the extent that they're properly funded, that law enforcement officials are properly educated, that the systems that these laws establish function properly. Both pieces are vital, both what you have legally and the way that the law is executed. And in this case, it seems without question the system as a whole didn't work.
But, Rick, it's not entirely clear that they weren't following the law, even if there was a disconnect here, unless, as Pete says, they adjudicated this or that he was sent to some mental health facility, that it's not necessarily clear there was anything more they could have done, which is what I think has a lot of people listening to that pulling their hair out right now, saying, then what the heck are we supposed to do?
Yeah, the question remains, and Pete Williams pointed it out, is what does this FOID card actually mean, and what does the state police actually investigate, and did they know that he was in fact suicidal? Did they know that he threatened to kill his family? To the response of the police. The police came in response to a threat, right? So that's pretty serious.
And he bought the weapons afterwards.
He bought the weapons afterwards, and it seems to me this is what the red flag discussion is now all about, is to close this gap we keep talking about. Is how do you first, how do you identify this type of individual? And I do think the community has responsibility in that, because they're the ones who are going to be closest to them. And two, can law enforcement confiscate or prevent someone who is obviously emotionally disturbed, mentally disturbed, from having a weapon? I say yes, they should be able to do that. I do think there should be some strong ways of a legal person getting their weapons back for false accusation. But I don't think that's going to be prevalent. I think we'll save a lot more lives if we actually allow a judge to make a decision this person has made enough of a threat to himself or his community that he should not possess a weapon, period.
In the new law, even as it relates to the boyfriend loophole, which is supposed to detail those individuals that are romantic partners, if it's only a misdemeanor for which you were convicted, after 10 years' time, you're eligible to get your weapons back. So some of those protections do exist now, thanks to that new law. But Xochitl, to you, I guess, just I get a sense, we've heard from the president. I cover the White House in my day job, and he says, we've got to do more, and ultimately the only way this is going to happen is at the ballot box. Is that the only way this happens? It seems like this is so complex. You can see why at some point Americans almost throw up their hands with frustration, because now the issue goes back to mental health. Mitch McConnell says, they talked about mental health here. Is it a question of guns and the availability of these weapons? What do you do?
Well, I would be frustrated if, I think the American people should be frustrated right now. 45 people died, and you have political leaders playing ping pong and blaming each other, right? And I think in the coming days, we'll get some more answers about what exactly happened, the way that we did with Uvalde, and figure out, how did this happen? How did this occur in this community? And I think what both parties should do right now is have conversations about where are the holes. Let's bring politics out of this. I agree that, yes, we need a Democratic majority to get everything that Joe Biden wants to get done. But the reality is it shouldn't be political when you have 45 people who have died. We just passed a piece
we should say 45 shots, 7
45
killed.
shots, sorry.
Correct, yes.
And, we saw what Congress could do when you do come together, whenever there is a big shooting. Let's figure out where are the holes. Let's come together and let's figure out how we can solve it. And if we continue to see politics within Congress, then I do agree with Joe Biden. The only way that we can get it done is at the ballot box. But before that, we need to see the president and elected leaders come together and figure out how do we plug these holes? How do we prevent this from happening?
I think it's pretty clear at this point that there's no more hole plugging that's going to take place with this Congress.
Well, tech has a role, too, because they have the algorithms to spot these patterns, and they're pretty obvious after they happen.
Yeah, and then there has to be a pursuit of it once these things are flagged, as not too dissimilarly was the case here. Betsy, to you, what's striking to me is just this year has already just been like a total roller coaster, right? Like abortion all of a sudden blew up the whole conversation. Guns in Uvalde blew it up, preceding that. And now we're talking about it again, to say nothing about the topic of the Supreme Court more broadly as it relates, to all sorts of different issues and the conservative super majority right now. What dominates? At the end of the day, as Rick says, it's going to be pocketbook issues that a lot of Republicans are counting on being the dominant issue. Are these issues, abortion and guns, in particular enough to change that calculation, that calculus?
I think it's very unlikely that there's any dramatic change in poll numbers that we're seeing now and the ultimate midterm election outcome based on abortion and guns. Now, it's possible that there could be very small changes, and in some of these districts, small changes can have big impacts. But it's still several months until the midterms, and ultimately, most people, most of the time, vote based on their material well-being. Can they afford to put gas in their cars? How much does a gallon of milk cost? Issues that they deal with, every day of the week. That's not the case for everyone, and of course, these things can change. But on the whole, what Republicans are betting on and what Mitch McConnell, to the point of the reporting you flagged earlier, is encouraging his Republican conference to emphasize are those issues which are not going to change, which are not going to vacillate with the headlines. But look, inflation's likely to be with us for a long time. Gas is not about to suddenly get cheap. Yeah. Those issues are going to be a persistent undercurrent that affect everyone. Yeah, gas price is still a marquee that everybody passes every single day of their lives, still a dominant issue in the country. Betsy, nice to have you here in person. Xochitl, always nice to see you. Rick Tyler, nice to have you as well. That's going to do it for us. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson with the latest breaking news right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.